The U.S. Attorney's Office in Minneapolis, Minnesota, is speaking about the probe involving hundreds of millions of dollars of stolen COVID-era food programs. Let's listen in.
Housing instability, find and maintain stable housing. They did no such thing. Instead, they submitted fraudulent claims to Medicaid for services that they did not actually provide to those individual clients. In all, they obtained more than $750,000 in Medicaid payments through their fraud scheme, much of which they used for pretty extensive international travel, including to London, Sydney, Australia, Istanbul, Turkey, Dubai, and several locations in Saudi Arabia. The second case being announced today is United States versus Kamil Omar Salah, the owner of Safe Lodgings, Inc., another housing stabilization services company. As with the other defendants, Mr. Salah enrolled in the housing stabilization program and began claiming to be providing housing stabilization services to people that were leaving drug and alcohol rehabilitation facilities. Again, he did no such thing. Instead, he just submitted fraudulent claims for services that he never provided. He submitted more than $1.4 million in fraudulent Medicaid claims, which he used to purchase more than $150,000 in cryptocurrency, as well as to fund his lifestyle. We learned recently that Mr. Salah actually fled the United States, after his company received a grand jury subpoena for records related to its participation in the Housing Stabilization Services program. The fourth and fifth defendants are charged in United States versus Anthony Waddell Jefferson and Lester Brown. And this case is slightly different. This is an instance of what's essentially fraud tourism. Mr. Jefferson and Brown were residents of Philadelphia who had no connection to Minnesota, except for they heard that Minnesota and its Housing Stabilization Services program was easy money. And so they traveled to Minnesota, enrolled their companies, Chosen Runner LLC and Retzel Real Estate LLC, in the Housing Stabilization Services Medicaid program here in Minnesota. They then returned to Philadelphia and began submitting fraudulent claims to Minnesota Medicaid here, through which they obtained more than $3.5 million in fraudulent Medicaid payments. This fraud tourism is new, although we've heard of it as investigators here. I mean, these defendants came here not to enjoy our lakes, our beautiful summers, or our warm people. They came here because they knew and understood that Minnesota was a place where taxpayer money could be taken with little risk and few consequences. Fortunately, through the hard work of the agents, that we have been able to charge them for their role here. Now, to date, we have charged 13 people for their role in the scheme to defraud the Housing Stabilization Services program, and that investigation remains very much ongoing. We expect additional charges in the coming weeks and months. I also want to announce some updates in the fraud scheme, or the scheme to defraud the Early Intensive Development and Behavior Intervention for Autism program, another Medicaid program here in the state of Minnesota. Today we unsealed charges against the second defendant charged in the case, Abdi Najib Hassan Youssef, who owns Star Autism Center in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Mr. Youssef, like others involved in the autism scheme, paid kickbacks to parents to have their children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and enrolled to receive EIDBI services at his autism center. Based on these fraudulent claims for services that were not provided, and in many cases were not needed, he received more than $6 million in Medicaid funds. He used some of those proceeds to purchase a semi-truck for $100,000, and he also sent more than $200,000 to Kenya. Earlier this morning at 10:30, the first defendant charged in the autism fraud scheme, Asha Farah Hassan, pled guilty. As you may recall, Ms. Farah was the owner of Smart Therapy LLC, a Minneapolis-based autism clinic. Through her clinic, she participated in both a scheme to defraud the EIDBI program, as well as a scheme to fraudulently obtain federal child nutrition program funds under the sponsorship of Feeding Our Future. Through these fraud schemes, Ms. Hassan received more than $14 million in Medicaid payments and more than $450,000 in federal child nutrition program funds, of which she sent at least hundreds of thousands of dollars to Kenya, which were used to purchase real estate. Now this morning, that's the EIDBI program. This morning we also executed a search warrant related to investigation into another Medicaid program here in Minnesota, a state Medicaid program called Integrated Community Supports, or ICS. ICS was a program that started in 2021 here in the state of Minnesota. It was designed to help people with disabilities live more independently in the community with assistance, with one-on-one help with health issues, safety, and other household tasks to allow them to live in the community as opposed to in an institution. Through this program, providers obtain apartments in which their ICS clients can live. In theory, the providers are supposed to be giving daily assistance to those clients to help them live independently in the community. That assistance can include community participation, helping them get out and about in the community, helping them with household management, setting up medical appointments, and issues with household safety and day-to-day safety. In reality, what the investigation has shown is that many ICS providers did no such thing. Instead, they simply obtained apartments or condos, which they rented to people who they got qualified to receive ICS services, people with disabilities that would qualify them to receive ICS services, and then just put them in there and started billing. The ICS program would allow providers to bill hundreds of dollars a day for each ICS client that they had, often more than $100,000 or even $200,000 a year for each ICS client. But in reality, that's not what was happening. Now, this program, like the others, this ICS program saw a similar pattern of explosive growth in recent years. Since beginning in 2021, the first year that Minnesota offered Medicaid coverage for integrated community supports, has grown from $4.6 million in 2021 to more than $170 million in 2024. And as you can see, the 2025 numbers were through September 30th, but they're on pace for nearly $180 million, despite the efforts to get a handle on the fraud in recent months here in Minnesota. In all, since 2021, Medicaid has paid out more than $400 million to Minnesota providers of ICS support services. Now, this pattern you see on the board is very similar to ones you might be familiar with in these other investigations. You see that explosive, even exponential growth. The housing stabilization services, which also started in 2021, has a similar pattern of growth. It just kept growing and growing and growing each year. And again, this program was estimated to cost $2.5 million a year. But the data from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services show that it costs significantly more than that. And in fact, housing stabilization has cost more than $300 million since 2021. The EIDBI Autism program has a similar pattern. It's cost the state more than $1 billion since starting in 2018, or it's cost Medicaid more than $1 billion, and has grown, as you can see, every year significantly larger. And of course, the original scheme that started all this was Feeding Our Future and the Federal Child Nutrition Program, and as you can see here, a similar pattern of explosive growth. I want to talk a little generally about the investigation and the scope. I know there's been a lot of questions recently about the scope of the fraud and the amount lost. The state in recent months has flagged 14 Medicaid programs as having significant fraud problems. For those 14 programs, which include the Housing Stabilization Services Program and the EIDBI Autism Program, the state's issued a payment suspension for 90 days. They've ordered a third-party audit of all providers in those programs, and they've even canceled the Housing Stabilization Services program altogether. Now, these services, there are many more. PCA services, adult day services, non-emergency medical transportation. Now, we've been talking for some months about the fraud problem in Minnesota, and I've always believed that if you speak the truth in a plain-spoken way, people can handle it. Minnesotans and taxpayers deserve to know the truth of the fraud. The fraud is not small. It isn't isolated. The magnitude cannot be overstated. What we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes. It's a staggering industrial-scale fraud. It's swamping Minnesota and calling into question everything we know about our state. I spoke in the fall about the iceberg I saw ahead. Something's fraud that's much larger than what's been visible to the public. When I said that, it wasn't hyperbole or rhetoric, it was a warning. And today I want to talk and I want to show here a sense of what that iceberg looks like, because I think people deserve to know what that is and how big this problem is, because we can't solve the problem until we grapple with the size of it. So the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services pulled the claims data for these 14 programs dating back to 2018. And those 14 programs in Minnesota have cost $18 billion since 2018, and more than $3.5 billion in 2024 alone. So that's a sense of the magnitude of the problem. These are the 14 Medicaid programs, which is just a part of Medicaid, these waivered services that have been flagged as having issues with program integrity and fraud. Now, I'm sure everyone is wondering how much of this $18 billion was fraud. It's not the $1 million question, that's the $18 billion question. The answer is far too much, and the task ahead of all of us is not only figuring out how much of that money was fraud, because we know a significant amount was, but figuring out how to put an end to the fraud in our state and get control of it. So let me end with this before I take questions. The magnitude of the fraud in Minnesota cannot be overstated. It's staggering amounts of money that have been lost. But it's not just about the money that's been stolen and wasted. This is a problem that's caused all of us to question what kind of state we live in. I think it's eroded our sense of collective statewide self-esteem and confidence. It's caused a state, as I've said before, that has long taken pride in having a strong economy, good schools, beautiful lakes, many parks, and a sense of community spirit and civic mindedness. This fraud really calls into question all of that. And I know that it's gone on, it's been allowed to go on far too long. And we need to do whatever we can to stop it in its tracks. Thank you.
Joe, could you give us a bare minimum of how much of that $18 billion you suspect will turn out to be fraud?
I think a significant portion.
Joe, could you talk about how much you have charged in court connected to fraud you've uncovered? What's the dollar amount of that?
Well, we prosecute people, not dollars. Feeding Our Future, Amy Bach, the head of Feeding Our Future, was convicted of carrying out a $240 to $250 million fraud scheme. Several other defendants that were charged in what we call collectively as the Feeding Our Future case were actually not under the sponsorship of Feeding Our Future. So the very first quote-unquote Feeding Our Future trial was actually a group of individuals that owned Empire Cuisine and Market and other related to companies. They carried out a $49 million fraud, almost all of which was under the sponsorship of another entity. Similarly, a case called United States versus Haji Salad, which charged 7 or 8 defendants with carrying out a $25 million fraud scheme under the sponsorship of Partners in Nutrition. So you do the math, $240, $250 million plus $50 million plus $25 million. That's well into the $300 millions just in the federal child nutrition program fraud scheme. These other programs here, housing stabilization, autism now between 6 and 14, that's $20 million that's charged in the autism program so far. housing stabilization. I haven't done the math, but it's well over 10 that's charged now. And obviously that's just this team's efforts. There's other prosecutions going on that have been flagged for many people, evergreen recoveries.
All right, so following the money and a major result, the Minnesota U.S. Attorney announces charges in many fraud cases. Of course, this is information you can read up on our website, cbsnews.com. Those new indictments happening today in a widening Minnesota fraud scandal, this time involving two Philadelphia-based men accused of traveling to Minnesota after a friend told them the taxpayer-funded programs there presented, quote, a good opportunity to make money.